In a quiet parish in Ohio, behind the sacred walls where prayers echoed every Sunday morning, where families brought their deepest hopes and fears, something unthinkable was happening. Father Michael Harrison, a man the entire community looked up to, a man who had baptized their children and comforted them through their darkest hours, was living a lie so shocking it would shatter the faith of everyone who knew him. Two young sisters, Sarah and Emily Thompson, devoted their entire lives to serving God in the local convent, believing they were safe, protected by their faith and the sacred vows that surrounded them. But trust, even in the holiest of places, can become a weapon, and the very man meant to guide their souls would become their greatest source of pain. This is the true story of betrayal, manipulation, and the courage it took to finally speak the truth. A story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about sacred trust. Before we continue with this shocking revelation, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Father Michael Harrison had been the cornerstone of St. Mary's Parish for over 15 years. At 52 years old, he was the kind of priest parents felt comfortable leaving their children with. His sermons were powerful, his counsel was sought by everyone from teenage girls struggling with doubt to elderly widows grieving their husbands. The man had an almost magnetic presence. When he spoke, people listened. When he offered guidance, families followed without question. His reputation extended far beyond the church walls. The local newspaper had featured him twice for his community service work, and the mayor often called on him to speak at civic events. Father Harrison wasn't just a priest. He was a pillar of the entire community, a man whose word carried the weight of divine authority. The Thompson sisters had arrived at the convent 3 years earlier, fresh-faced and full of hope. Sarah, 24, was the older of the two, a quiet, thoughtful young woman who had always felt called to religious life. She had given up a promising career as a teacher to follow what she believed was God's plan for her life. Her sister Emily, just 22, had followed Sarah's example, inspired by her older sister's devotion and certainty. Both sisters came from a deeply religious family in Kansas, where their parents had raised them to see religious service as the highest calling. Their mother had cried tears of joy when both daughters announced their decision to enter religious life. Their father, a deacon in their home parish, had never been prouder. The convent of St. Mary's was supposed to be their sanctuary. Built in 1923, the brick building housed 12 sisters who dedicated their lives to prayer, community service, and spiritual growth. The daily routine was structured and peaceful. Morning prayers at 6, breakfast together in silence, followed by individual work assignments that ranged from teaching at the local Catholic school to caring for elderly parishioners. The evenings were spent in communal prayer and reflection. It was exactly the life both Sarah and Emily had dreamed of, a life of purpose, service, and closeness to God. Mother Superior Catherine, a woman in her 70s who had run the convent for over 2 decades, had welcomed the Thompson sisters with open arms, seeing in them the dedication and purity of heart she valued above all else. It started so gradually that neither sister recognized the danger. Father Harrison began requesting private spiritual counseling sessions with both Sarah and Emily, claiming that young sisters needed extra guidance to strengthen their faith. These meetings, initially held in his office during daylight hours, seemed perfectly normal. Other sisters had similar sessions with him, and Mother Superior had approved them as part of their spiritual development. Father Harrison was charming and attentive during these early meetings, asking about their prayer life, their struggles with homesickness, their questions about their calling. He seemed genuinely interested in their spiritual growth, offering books to read and prayers to memorize. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to change. The meetings moved from his office to a small private chapel in the basement of the church, a place where they were unlikely to be interrupted. Father Harrison explained that the quiet, sacred space would help them focus better on their spiritual journey. The conversations began to shift from purely religious topics to more personal ones. He asked about their lives before the convent, their relationships with their family, their fears and insecurities. At first, both sisters felt honored by his interest. Here was this respected man of God taking such personal care in their spiritual development. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. Father Harrison began telling them that they were special, different from the other sisters. He claimed that God had revealed to him that Sarah and Emily had been chosen for a higher purpose, a deeper level of spiritual understanding that required complete trust and obedience. He told them that their spiritual journey would involve tests that others couldn't understand, experiences that might seem strange, but were actually expressions of divine love. He quoted scripture about surrendering completely to God's will, about the importance of absolute obedience to spiritual authority. The sisters, raised to respect religious hierarchy and taught to see doubt as a weakness of faith, began to accept his words as truth. The physical boundaries started to dissolve during what Father Harrison called spiritual healing sessions. He told the sisters that physical touch was a conduit for divine grace, that through his blessed hands, God could heal their spiritual wounds and purify their souls. What began as hands placed on their shoulders during prayer gradually became more invasive, more inappropriate. But each violation was wrapped in religious language, presented as a sacred ritual that only they were spiritually mature enough to understand. He convinced them that their discomfort was actually Satan trying to interfere with their spiritual growth, that true holiness required them to overcome their earthly resistance to God's will. The isolation was perhaps the most cruel aspect of his manipulation. Father Harrison convinced both sisters that their special relationship with God through him must remain secret. He told them that other people, even other religious sisters, wouldn't understand the advanced spiritual practices they were engaged in. He claimed that sharing details of their sessions would not only jeopardize their own spiritual progress, but could also scandalize weaker believers who weren't ready for such deep spiritual truths. The sisters found themselves carrying a burden they couldn't share with anyone, not with Mother Superior, not with their fellow sisters, not even with each other initially. If you're still watching at this point, comment "I'm still here" so I know you're following along. And I have to ask you, how would you feel if someone you trusted completely, someone you believed spoke for God himself, began to manipulate your faith for their own purposes? Can you imagine the confusion, the fear, the crushing weight of believing that your suffering was somehow holy? By the end of their second year at the convent, both Sarah and Emily were showing signs of severe emotional distress. Sarah, once cheerful and eager to participate in community activities, became withdrawn and anxious. She began experiencing panic attacks during communal prayers, especially when Father Harrison was present. Her appetite disappeared, and she lost nearly 20 pounds in 3 months. The other sisters noticed her hands shaking during morning prayers, how she would flinch when anyone touched her unexpectedly, how she would find excuses to avoid being alone in any room where Father Harrison might appear. Emily's response was different but equally concerning. She became obsessively religious, spending hours beyond the required prayer time in the chapel, sometimes falling asleep, kneeling on the cold stone floor. She began practicing extreme forms of penance that weren't part of their community's tradition. Fasting for days at a time, wearing a rough rope belt that left marks on her skin, staying awake all night in prayer. When other sisters expressed concern, Emily would claim that God was calling her to suffer for the sins of the world, that her pain was a gift that brought her closer to Christ's own suffering. Sister Margaret, a middle-aged woman who had been at the convent for over a decade, was the first to suspect something was seriously wrong. She had taken a protective interest in the Thompson sisters since their arrival, remembering her own difficult adjustment to religious life. One evening, she found Sarah crying in the convent garden, her body shaking with sobs so violent she could barely breathe. When Sister Margaret tried to comfort her, Sarah pulled away as if her touch was painful, mumbling something about not being worthy of kindness. That night, Sister Margaret prayed harder than she had in years, asking God to show her how to help these young women who were clearly in deep spiritual and emotional crisis. The breaking point came on a cold February evening. Emily had been summoned for one of her special sessions with Father Harrison, but unlike the previous times, she couldn't force herself to go. She sat in her small convent room, staring at the crucifix on her wall, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to really think about what was happening to her. The doubts she had been pushing away, the questions she had been told were temptations from Satan, came flooding back. She realized that what was happening in those sessions had nothing to do with God, nothing to do with spiritual growth, nothing to do with holiness. It was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. That night, Emily knocked on Sarah's door for the first time in over a year. The sisters had barely spoken to each other since the sessions began, both carrying shame that prevented them from reaching out to the one person who might understand. When Sarah opened the door and saw Emily's tear-stained face, she knew immediately why her sister had come. They held each other and cried for hours, finally sharing the burden they had each been carrying alone. In whispered voices, they compared their experiences, realizing that Father Harrison had been manipulating them both in identical ways, using the same scripture verses, the same spiritual justifications, the same threats about what would happen if they ever told anyone. The sisters spent the next 3 days in agonizing prayer and discussion, trying to decide what to do. They were terrified of not being believed, scared that people would think they had somehow tempted this holy man or misunderstood his intentions. They worried about the scandal it would cause, about the damage to their parents' faith, about whether anyone would ever trust them again. But they also knew they couldn't continue living with the secret, couldn't pretend that what was happening was acceptable. Most importantly, they realized that if Father Harrison was doing this to them, he might be doing it to other young women, other vulnerable people who trusted him. Sarah was the first to speak. On a quiet Thursday morning in March, she knocked on Mother Superior Catherine's door with a request for a private meeting. Mother Superior, who had been growing increasingly concerned about both Thompson sisters' obvious distress, immediately agreed. Sarah sat in the small, simple office where she had first been welcomed to the convent 3 years earlier, but everything felt different now. The crucifix on the wall, the religious books lining the shelves, even Mother Superior's kind face. Everything reminded her of the trust she had placed in religious authority, and how terribly that trust had been violated. The words came slowly at first. Sarah struggled to find language for experiences that Father Harrison had taught her had no earthly words. Experiences he had convinced her were beyond normal human understanding. But as she continued talking, as Mother Superior's face grew pale with horror and disbelief, Sarah found strength she didn't know she possessed. She told Mother Superior everything: the private sessions, the inappropriate touching, the religious justifications, the threats and manipulation, the way her faith had been twisted into a weapon against her. Mother Superior Catherine had been a nun for over 50 years. She had seen religious communities through good times and bad, had dealt with personality conflicts and administrative challenges, had counseled sisters through doubts and difficulties. But nothing in her decades of religious life had prepared her for this revelation. As Sarah spoke, Mother Superior felt her own faith shaking, not faith in God, but faith in the institution she had served her entire adult life, faith in the judgment of the bishops who had placed Father Harrison in this position, faith in her own ability to protect the young women under her care. The most difficult part came when Sarah revealed that Emily had also been victimized. Mother Superior immediately called Emily to the office, and though the younger sister was initially reluctant to speak, Sarah's courage gave her the strength to share her own story. As the two sisters sat together, supporting each other through the most difficult conversation of their lives, Mother Superior realized the full scope of the betrayal. This wasn't a single incident or a misunderstanding. This was a systematic pattern of abuse carried out by a man who had used his religious authority to exploit the very faith that was supposed to protect these young women. Mother Superior's first instinct was to handle the situation quietly within the religious community. She was from a generation that believed scandals should be resolved privately to protect the reputation of the church. But as she listened to the sisters' stories, as she saw the depth of their trauma and the calculated nature of Father Harrison's manipulation, she realized that quiet resolution was not just impossible, it was morally wrong. These weren't mistakes or moments of weakness. These were serious crimes committed by someone in a position of sacred trust. The confrontation with Father Harrison took place the following day. Mother Superior, accompanied by 2 other senior religious leaders from the diocese, met with him in his office. At first, Father Harrison denied everything, claiming that the sisters had misunderstood his spiritual guidance, that they were emotionally unstable young women who had misinterpreted his pastoral care. He spoke eloquently about his years of faithful service, about his dedication to the parish, about how impossible it would be for him to do the things they were accusing him of. But when presented with specific details that only someone who had committed these acts would know, when confronted with the identical patterns in both sisters' accounts, Father Harrison's composure began to crack. The man who had seemed so confident, so authoritative, so divinely inspired, gradually revealed himself to be exactly what the sisters had discovered him to be, a manipulative predator who had used religion to hide his crimes. By the end of the meeting, while he still refused to admit the full extent of his actions, it was clear to everyone present that the sisters were telling the truth. The news spread through St. Mary's Parish like a devastating fire. Father Harrison was immediately suspended from all priestly duties while a full investigation was conducted. The bishop's office issued a carefully worded statement about serious allegations and the need for a thorough review, but word of the real situation quickly spread through the tight-knit community. People who had trusted Father Harrison completely, who had sought his counsel during their most vulnerable moments, suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about him. The reaction from parishioners was as varied as it was intense. Some refused to believe the allegations, convinced that this beloved priest was being falsely accused by disturbed young women. These supporters organized prayer vigils for Father Harrison and sent letters to the bishop demanding his immediate reinstatement. They argued that a man who had done so much good, who had been such a pillar of faith in their community, couldn't possibly be guilty of such terrible acts. Their denial was fierce and sometimes cruel. They suggested that the sisters had mental health issues, that they had been influenced by anti-Catholic sentiment, that they were seeking attention or money. But others in the parish were devastated by the realization that their spiritual father had betrayed not just the sisters, but the entire community's trust. These parishioners found themselves looking back at their interactions with Father Harrison with new eyes, remembering moments that had seemed slightly odd at the time, comments that had made them uncomfortable, situations where his behavior hadn't quite felt right. Parents who had allowed their teenage daughters to have private counseling sessions with him were consumed by guilt and fear, wondering what might have happened to their own children. The Thompson sisters faced their own unique hell during this period. While some people supported them and praised their courage for speaking out, others treated them as if they were the criminals. They received anonymous letters calling them liars and attention seekers. Some parishioners crossed the street to avoid speaking to them. The sisters, who had once been welcomed warmly in local Catholic businesses, found themselves facing cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when they entered a room. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the impact on their own family. When the sisters called their parents in Kansas to explain what had happened, the conversation was one of the most difficult in their family's history. Their father, the deacon who had been so proud of his daughter's religious calling, struggled to understand how something so terrible could happen in a place he had believed was holy and safe. Their mother blamed herself for encouraging her daughters to enter religious life, wondering if she had somehow failed to prepare them for the realities of the world, even within the church. The investigation by church authorities was thorough but painful for everyone involved. The sisters had to recount their experiences multiple times to different officials, reliving their trauma with each retelling. Church investigators interviewed other sisters at the convent, parish staff members, and community leaders to build a complete picture of Father Harrison's behavior. During this process, 2 other women came forward with their own stories of inappropriate conduct by Father Harrison, a former parish secretary who had quit her job suddenly 2 years earlier, and a young married woman who had sought marriage counseling from him. The final church tribunal convened 6 months after Sarah first spoke to Mother Superior. Father Harrison was found guilty of serious violations of his vows and his priestly responsibilities. He was immediately defrocked, stripped of his priestly authority, and banned from any future ministry. The diocese also reported his actions to civil authorities, though the statute of limitations had expired for criminal prosecution in most of the alleged incidents. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so divinely blessed, left the community in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, his life's work revealed to be a facade hiding predatory behavior. But the end of Father Harrison's career was not the end of the story's impact. The Thompson sisters faced a long, difficult journey of healing that would take years to complete. They both left the convent, unable to continue their religious calling in the wake of such a traumatic betrayal of their faith. Sarah eventually became a counselor specializing in helping survivors of religious abuse, finding a way to transform her painful experience into a source of healing for others. Emily struggled for years with depression and anxiety before finally finding peace working with a nonprofit organization that supported vulnerable women. The parish of St. Mary's was forever changed. A new priest, Father David Chen, was assigned to help the community heal, but attendance at Sunday Mass dropped by nearly 40% and never fully recovered. Many families left to join other parishes or stopped attending church altogether. The close-knit community that had once rallied around shared faith found itself divided by suspicion, anger, and differing opinions about what had happened and how it should have been handled. Mother Superior Catherine retired 6 months after the scandal broke, carrying tremendous guilt about her failure to recognize the signs of abuse earlier. She spent her remaining years advocating for better training and oversight to prevent similar situations in other religious communities. The convent itself struggled financially and emotionally, with several sisters leaving religious life entirely and new vocations becoming increasingly rare. The broader implications of the case rippled through the entire diocese and beyond. New policies were implemented requiring multiple people to be present during any private counseling sessions. Background checks became more thorough, and training programs were developed to help religious leaders recognize the warning signs of abuse. But for many people, the damage to their trust in religious institutions was irreparable. How do you rebuild faith after such a fundamental betrayal? How do you trust again when the person you believed spoke for God was using that divine authority to cause harm? These were the questions that haunted not just the direct victims, but everyone who had been part of St. Mary's Parish during Father Harrison's tenure. Some found their way back to faith through different paths, different communities, different understandings of what it meant to be religious. Others never returned, their spiritual lives permanently altered by the realization that evil could hide behind the most sacred of masks. The Thompson sisters' courage in speaking out had prevented other potential victims from suffering similar abuse. But the cost of that courage was enormous. They had lost not just their calling to religious life, but their innocence, their sense of safety, their trust in institutions they had been raised to revere. They had been forced to choose between their own well-being and the protection of a system that had failed to protect them, and they had chosen to speak truth even when that truth was devastating to hear. This case became part of a larger conversation about power, accountability, and protection of vulnerable people within religious institutions. It raised uncomfortable questions about how religious authority can be misused, about how victims of abuse within faith communities are often pressured to stay silent to protect the institution's reputation, about how the very faith that should provide comfort and healing can be weaponized by predators. What do you think about this story? How would you feel if you had trusted someone completely, only to discover they had been manipulating and harming vulnerable people under the guise of spiritual guidance? Do you think the consequences Father Harrison faced were adequate, or should there have been harsher punishment? And most importantly, how can religious communities better protect their most vulnerable members from predators who use faith as a weapon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that expose the darker side of institutions we're taught to trust without question. These stories need to be told, and these voices need to be heard.